Okay. So what does Frau Heger, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, who
Yes.
also thought of this thought
Oh, it's
experiment?
correct, yes.
Great. What does she think about your interpretation?
Okay, so actually she left science after her PhD, and she kind of observes, she observes the whole development from the outside. So she reads all the like public articles that are written. So there are sometimes even some press articles in the press about it, and but she's no longer very close to the subject. She now works in software engineering.
Did you so disturb her with your metaphysical insights?
I hope not. No, I think this was, it's a good point, because I had some other students who said that they would not for psychological reasons not be able to work on such projects. This would disturb them too much.
Wait.
So
that is super interesting. I want to hear more about
because it's at the end about, look, these projects are about like really the fundamental question of what are agents, in a sense. So what are we? And
yes.
When at the time when I was still a many-worlder, of course the kind of implications that it would have on us, even on decisions we are taking, are kind of quite dramatic. I mean, if we know we make a decision and we are now experiencing both outcomes, that kind of has an impact on what we are doing, or at least for me it was I cannot give you a practical example, an impact, but it's kind of worrying to know that, or to think this is the true story. And so now I'm now in a kind of in this view that I currently have, where there are no absolute facts. This is again in some way worrying, because of course people come with the idea there is something absolute out there in the world. And then they start working on this, and they suddenly realize, look, something must be wrong with that view, that there is something here in the world. And then suddenly everything falls apart. All this, kind of the whole model one had of the world has to be revised. And then some people take this very seriously and say, look, if everything has to be revised, if things are not out there, there's just everything is just kind of in my mind, which is, for example, suggested by these epistemic views, then one can ask really fundamental questions about what's really now the goal of our lives if there's nothing out there. And so, interestingly, some of my collaborators say they kind of don't link that question to real life. So they completely separate that. They work on that and have opinions about how it is, but somehow they disconnect it from their daily life. But there are others who say this is intrinsically connected, and they're still happy with that. But there are others that connect it and find it very stressful that this is connected, because it constantly tells them that, or reminds them that it's not clear how all that makes sense that they see. So I think it is very fundamental and very emotional in a sense.
So, okay, you also said, I think in Quantum magazine many years ago, that one's choice of interpretation of quantum mechanics is very emotional. So I want to know what you meant by that.
Yeah, so I think actually almost any decision, not only what interpretation we are admitting, is at the end kind of an emotional decision. Because let's say if we ask ourselves, what are rational arguments? So, we of course try to be rational, but the rationality always hinges on certain, let's say, goals that we set or assumptions that we took. And these assumptions or goals cannot by themselves be kind of supported by rational reasoning. So, for example, if someone asks me, why am I now convinced at the moment, or why was I convinced at the time that there is many worlds? And if I now think back, why was I convinced? Then I think it was actually an experience, in a sense, that I learned quantum mechanics in a very standard quantum mechanics course. And the very standard quantum mechanics course, now in retrospect, are, in my opinion, not good quantum mechanics courses, because you basically learn how to solve the Schrödinger equation.
Right.
And that's not giving much insight into what happens in quantum theory. Now, I was very kind of unhappy with that, but I didn't know why, because I didn't know anything else. So I just learned it, and I thought, okay, that's a bit like electrodynamics. I just now have a new system of equations. It's no longer the Maxwell equation, it's now the Schrödinger equation, and I learned how to solve it in different potentials and so on. And then at some point I started looking into quantum information and quantum computing. I mean, this was not very popular at the time. This was in the year around the year 2000, when almost no one was working on the subject, at least here at ETH Zurich, where I studied. And so, nonetheless, I started to read these papers for a seminar that was organized by a professor here. And then I suddenly realized there are these concepts like superposition, entanglement, and I couldn't really make sense of that. I couldn't also match it to what I learned in the quantum mechanics course. But then at some point I learned about these papers about many worlds. And then suddenly things started to make sense of me. And I realized, okay, I can just see the whole world as a big wave function. And then the entanglement makes sense because I'm just part of that. And suddenly everything cleared up. And this was such a revealing thing that I was immediately convinced that must be the right view, because it was so much better than what I've seen before. So I was really kind of extremely happy when I realized that. And I didn't doubt that this must be correct, because it was just such a change from what I've seen before. So before it was just some equation and I couldn't really see what's going on. And then suddenly everything cleared up. So that was, in a sense, a very emotional moment. And because the change was so positive, from not understanding things that don't make sense to suddenly something that kind of fit together. I could fit in how measurements work and so on. Then I was just convinced because of that. And I thought that must be the right thing. Then I started to, of course, investigate that more. And actually, paradoxically, the more I talked to people who are actually proponents of many worlds, the more I got doubts about the correctness, because I had some initial questions that I couldn't answer, like what does probability mean in many worlds? And I thought those people who were thinking about many worlds for a long time, they will certainly be able to give convincing answers. But then while talking to them, I realized there are no good answers. So I got more and more disappointed about that. But it was, again, like I couldn't say there was this argument. It's just a feeling that you somehow have the impression these are not convincing answers. But it's not necessarily a rational thing. I mean, there were arguments that just didn't match what I kind of was hoping to hear. I was kind of hoping there's some natural thing behind, but the arguments seem to be very fine-tuned on, we do stuff in this and this basis, and there's so I just got, again, a kind of bad emotional feeling about these explanations, and I got more and more unhappy. And then I had another kind of encounter with cubism, and this cleared up all these thoughts. Suddenly these probabilities made sense. And it was, again, like a very positive moment for me. And I couldn't necessarily say there was, again, some really rational thought process leading to that. It was just that in total things made more sense. It somehow resolved stuff that before were really stuck, and I couldn't. So I was stuck with many like concepts like probabilities and so on, and the basis choice in many worlds.
Mm-hmm.
And then this suddenly resolved again, and then I was a kind of almost completely convinced cubist. And now the problem is that this thought experiment with Daniela Flauchiger puts that again in question, because cubism doesn't have a good answer about what is this assumption about the consistency between agents. So cubism is kind of a single agent theory. I mean, okay, cubists would now deny that. They say it can be applied by many agents, but what is missing is there is no rule of how the agents would actually combine their knowledge. And that's somehow needed. I need to somehow be able to say that if you have some knowledge about something and you communicate that to me, how do I incorporate that knowledge into my knowledge? And there's simply no rule. So I couldn't even say it's wrong, but there is no rule. And they have also not been able to find a convincing rule, in my opinion. I mean, there were some papers by Chris Fuchs and others where they tried to come up with such consistency rules, or so I think there's a paper about the title is something like respecting one's fellows. So it's really about, I have fellow physicists and I want to include their knowledge. But here there's something that, like, again, this more negative emotional feeling that it doesn't feel like the right answer. Although I cannot at beginning point to the flaw. It's just the rules that they introduce feel very ad hoc, and they don't really resolve at the moment, or they don't really match the thought experiments, or I can't really fully resolve them with these rules. So it's again an emotional state that tells me it's not the right thing.
So what have you landed on then, interpretation-wise?
I'm now in no man's land, in a sense. So I don't see any of the interpretations that's currently existing is satisfactory. And the reason is mainly because these interpretations simply don't talk about the situation of having more than one agent. I mean, they don't exclude it, but they don't tell me how to deal with the situation. And what is very important in this thought experiment that I have with Daniela Frauchiger is the communication between agents, or how they incorporate knowledge of other agents. And this is just not defined in a sense. So the theories don't tell me what to do. So cubism tells me how to update knowledge if I make a measurement, but it doesn't tell me how to update knowledge if another agent tells me what his knowledge or her knowledge is. And that's just missing, and it's not obvious how to add that rule. And therefore, it's kind of more incompleteness of these interpretations, and there's no obvious completion, so to speak. And in more recent work I now did, I guess you mentioned that, the against probability, I tried to kind of identify what the problem is, that maybe it's fundamentally wrong to try to capture things in, like, knowledge in terms of probabilities.
The Economist covers math, physics, philosophy, and AI in a manner that shows how different countries perceive developments and how they impact markets. They recently published a piece on China's new neutrino detector. They cover extending life via mitochondrial transplants, creating an entirely new field of medicine. But it's also not just science. They analyze culture, they analyze finance, economics, business, international affairs across every region. I'm particularly liking their new Insider feature. It was just launched this month. It gives me a front row access to The Economist's internal editorial debates, where senior editors argue through the news with world leaders and policymakers in twice weekly long format shows. Basically, an extremely high-quality podcast. Something else you should know about is that if you go to their app, they not only have daily articles, but they also have long-form podcasts with their editors and writers. This is also available online. Whether it's scientific innovation or shifting global politics, The Economist provides comprehensive coverage beyond headlines. As a TOE listener, you get a special discount. Head over to economist.com/TOE to subscribe. That's economist.com/TOE for your discount.